All right, so get ready because today we are diving into some serious history. We're going to be tackling American trade policies and how they've shaped not just the U.S., but the whole world.
Sounds fascinating.
We've got excerpts from a historical analysis of American trade policies reshaping the global order. It's an article that was published just this month on the Niti Shastra platform.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah, by Navroop Singh and Himja Parekh.
You know what's fascinating about that is that they break down U.S. trade policy into like three distinct phases.
Okay.
Revenue restriction and reciprocity. And it's like watching a pendulum swing throughout history
Yeah.
as the U.S. reacts to all these different global and economic pressures.
I like that. It's a great way to kind of understand the big picture.
Yeah.
I mean, think about America right after independence.
Right.
They get slammed by trade restrictions from Britain.
Oh, yeah.
Their economy tanks.
Exactly. And that's where tariffs come in.
Yeah.
Not just to protect those fragile industries,
Yeah.
but like as a major source of revenue for the fledgling nation.
Right.
This is where Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers becomes so important.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
He argued that tariffs were absolutely essential to shield young American industries
Right.
from being steamrolled by those like established European powerhouses.
It's amazing how one document can have such a lasting impact.
Yeah.
Did he basically set the stage for like a century of protectionist policies?
I think he really did. But it also ignited this long-running tension between the North and the South.
Right. Classic.
The North, with its industrial ambitions, loved those high tariffs.
Of course.
But the South, heavily reliant on agricultural exports,
Right.
wanted free trade. So you could argue this conflict was a simmering pot that contributed to the boiling point of the Civil War.
Okay, so tariffs in the Civil War. The article mentions that there's more to that story than just slavery.
Yeah,
Something about the South looking to Britain as a potential ally.
right. The South saw Britain's free trade stance as a potential lifeline,
Interesting.
a way to undermine the North's economic power. The article even claims that British free trade radicals, essentially those who fiercely advocated for free trade policies globally,
Okay.
saw an opportunity to keep America from becoming an industrial rival.
Wow, so they wanted to like keep Britain in charge.
They wanted to maintain Britain's grip on global trade, and a divided America served their interests.
Wow, so while the Civil War raged on American soil, there was this whole other economic battle happening across the Atlantic.
Absolutely.
It's mind-blowing how intertwined global politics and trade really are.
Totally. And then comes World War I, which completely reshuffles the global power dynamic.
Right.
Financial power shifts from London to New York,
Huge.
changing the entire game of international trade.
So that's when America started moving away from that restriction model and toward reciprocity, trying to open up markets and lower trade barriers, at least in theory.
Yes. But remember the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act of 1930?
Oh, yeah, that rings a bell, but vaguely.
It was the perfect example of how, even with good intentions, things can go very wrong.
Yeah, the article barely scratches the surface on that one.
Right.
What exactly happened?
Well, the U.S. economy was showing signs of weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Some industries were hurting, and Congress, as they often do,
Right.
decided to protect domestic interests by slapping tariffs on a whole bunch of imports.
Okay.
But the timing couldn't have been worse.
Oh, no.
The world was already teetering on the brink of economic disaster.
So, like, they were trying to put out a fire with gasoline?
Pretty much.
Oh,
It was complete disaster. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, global trade plummeted, and the Great Depression, which was already pretty bad, spiraled even further downward.
Okay, so Hawley-Smoot was a major fail.
Yeah.
What did the U.S. learn from that debacle?
It was a painful but crucial lesson. Hawley-Smoot demonstrated unequivocally that protectionism during a global economic downturn is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It backfired spectacularly, deepening the Depression and underlining the need for a more multilateral cooperative approach to trade. This fiasco forced a shift away from high tariffs and gave the president more power to negotiate trade deals. Plus, it became clear that the gold standard was actually contributing to global deflation, which made everything worse. All of this set the stage for a new era of international economic cooperation. And that's where the Bretton Woods Agreement comes in. One of the most significant turning points in modern economic history.
Bretton Woods, I feel like I've heard that name a million times but could never really explain it.
Right.
What was the big deal?
Okay, so picture this. It's the end of World War II.
Okay.
The world is in ruins, economies are shattered, and currencies are all over the map.
Yeah, rough time.
They desperately needed stability, like a framework to rebuild, and a way to avoid another global economic meltdown.
Right. Makes sense.
Bretton Woods provided that framework.
So how did they actually achieve that stability?
It was a pretty bold move. They established the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency pegged to gold.
Okay.
This meant that other countries could exchange their currencies for dollars, which in turn could be exchanged for gold.
Gotcha.
It provided a sense of stability and predictability in the global financial system.
So the U.S. dollar basically became the gold standard for the world, even more so than actual gold.
Exactly, and it had a huge impact on American competitiveness.
How so?
Well, since everyone wanted dollars, the U.S. could essentially print money to finance its growth and its global ambitions.
Wow, so they had a big advantage.
They did, but like any system, it had its vulnerabilities.
Right, nothing's perfect.
And those vulnerabilities started to show by the late 1960s.
Okay.
The fixed exchange rate between the dollar and gold was becoming unsustainable. The U.S. was running trade deficits, and foreign central banks were getting nervous about the value of their dollar reserves.
Oh, so they were starting to lose faith.
They started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, putting a strain on U.S. gold reserves.
So it was like a financial game of hot potato with everyone trying to get rid of their dollars before they lost value.
That's a great analogy.
Uh-huh.
And Nixon, under immense economic pressure, decided to call the game.
Oh, wow.
He closed the gold window, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system and letting the dollar float freely on currency markets.
Bold move. What happened next? How did the world react?
It was a time of huge uncertainty and volatility in the markets.
I bet.
But the U.S. dollar remained the dominant global currency.
So it survived?
It did. Part of that was due to another strategic move by Nixon.
Okay.
He negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia, which controlled vast oil reserves to price oil exclusively in dollars.
Oh, wow. So everyone needed dollars to buy oil.
On top of that, they agreed to reinvest their oil revenues in U.S. Treasury securities.
Oh.
This created what we call the petrodollar system, further cementing the dollar's dominance on a global scale.
So even though the dollar wasn't tied to gold anymore, the demand for it remained high because everyone needed it to buy oil. Pretty clever.
It was a brilliant move, really. But the 70s and 80s weren't a cakewalk for the U.S. economy.
Oh, what happened?
Japan's highly efficient manufacturing sector was booming.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about it.
They were flooding the global markets with their products, and U.S. manufacturers were feeling the heat.
This is where the Plaza Accord of 1985 comes in, right?
Yes.
The U.S., Japan, and Europe basically got together to manipulate currency values. And the article also mentions Reagan's fair trade policies.
Right.
Wasn't he all about free markets?
Well, the Plaza Accord was a fascinating example of international economic diplomacy, if you can call it that. The U.S. dollar had become so strong that it was hurting American exports and causing these huge trade imbalances, especially with Japan.
Okay.
So the major economic powers agreed to intervene in the currency markets to weaken the dollar and strengthen the Japanese yen.
Hold on. How does weakening your own currency help? Wouldn't that make things more expensive for Americans?
Not necessarily. When you weaken your currency, your exports become cheaper for other countries to buy.
Okay.
This can help boost your exports and reduce your trade deficit.
Of course.
At the same time, a stronger currency makes imports more expensive, which can help protect domestic industries. So in theory, everybody wins.
Okay, I see the logic there. But what about Reagan and this fair trade thing?
Reagan was a complex figure when it came to trade.
In what way?
He believed in free markets, but also recognized that sometimes you need to level the playing field. He saw Japan's economic practices as giving them an unfair advantage and pushed for measures to counter them.
So even though he championed free markets, he was willing to step in when he felt American businesses were being treated unfairly. That seems pretty pragmatic.
It does, and it's important to remember that context is everything. The rise of China in the late 20th and early 21st century completely changed the global trade landscape, and it continues to be a source of tension for the U.S. But we'll get into that in the next part.
Okay, so before we got sidetracked, we were talking about China really shaking things up on the global trade stage. And it's kind of interesting because the article points out that the U.S. actually kind of had a hand in China's rise, first during the Cold War, and then by backing their entry into the WTO in 2001.
Yeah, it's almost ironic.
It really is.
During the Cold War, the U.S. saw China as a way to counter the Soviet Union.
Makes sense.
After the Soviet Union collapsed, the thinking shifted towards engaging with China economically.
Right.
Hoping to nudge them towards more political and economic openness.
But it seems like China had its own plans.
Exactly. China, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, took advantage of globalization, but on their own terms. They used it as a tool to rapidly build their economic and military power.
And that leads us to the trade wars and tariffs that have dominated headlines in recent years.
Right. The U.S. found itself facing a growing trade deficit with China,
Yeah.
along with concerns about intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices.
So the response was a much more confrontational approach.
Yeah, especially under the Trump administration.
So tariffs became the weapon of choice.
Yes, President Trump imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, and China retaliated with tariffs of their own. It was a classic trade war, with both sides trying to inflict enough economic pain to force the other to back down.
The article calls this the Great American Reset, arguing that the Trump administration's goal was to use tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., but it also warns about potential downsides, even comparing it to the protectionist policies of the 1930s.
Right. The argument is that the Trump administration wanted to fundamentally reshape global trade.
Okay.
They wanted to move away from the multilateral rules-based system that had been in place for decades
Uh-huh.
and shift towards a more bilateral transactional approach. It was about leveraging American economic power to get favorable deals.
So less about free trade and more about favorable trade for the U.S.
Exactly. The authors point to the administration's focus on using tariffs as bargaining chips to get concessions from other countries, especially China.
Right.
They also highlight the administration's skepticism of international organizations like the WTO,
Yeah.
which they saw as limiting U.S. economic freedom.
But the article also raises some red flags, right? Concerns about the potential fallout from these policies.
Definitely. They warn that this great American reset could trigger a wave of economic nationalism globally.
Oh.
This could lead to a spiral of protectionist measures and trade wars, ultimately hurting global economic growth and creating a more fragmented and unstable world.
It's a risky gamble then, kind of like pushing all your chips to the center of the table in a high-stakes poker game.
That's a great analogy. But what happens if the other players call the bluff?
Exactly.
We've already seen how tariffs can backfire. They can lead to higher prices for consumers, and businesses disrupt supply chains and ultimately harm economic growth.
And the article also worries about what this approach could mean for the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency.
That's a key point. If the U.S. starts using the dollar as a weapon in trade wars, other countries might lose trust and start looking for alternatives.
Yeah.
That could potentially undermine the dollar's global dominance.
So what does all of this mean for us? This deep dive has taken us on a wild ride through the history of American trade policy, from tariffs as a source of revenue to trade wars as a tool of foreign policy. It seems like we're at a crossroads.
The article paints a picture of a world grappling with uncertainty, where the old rules are being challenged. Will tariffs bring back American manufacturing, or will they trigger a new wave of economic nationalism? Will the U.S. maintain its economic dominance, or will we see a shift towards a more multipolar world? These are complex questions with no easy answers.
It really makes you think, what will the lasting impact of the Great American Reset be? Will it lead to a more prosperous and secure future for the U.S., or will it ultimately backfire? Hopefully, this deep dive has given you the historical context and insights to grapple with these crucial issues. The decisions made by policymakers today will have a profound impact on the global economy and on all of our lives.
The key takeaway here is to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking the tough questions. That's what will shape the future of global trade and ultimately determine what kind of world we will live in.